Hello, everyone, and welcome to the June 2024 installment of the Global Reads webinar series. We are grateful that you joined us today, and today's event is sponsored by the South Asia Book Award. My name is Andrea Fowler, and I am the Assistant Director at the Center for South Asia. I serve as the administrator of the Book Award along with my colleague, Essie Lenchner, who is Assistant Director at the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, otherwise known as IRIS-NRC at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The South Asia Book Award, sponsored by the South Asia National Outreach Consortium, is given annually for up to 3 outstanding works of literature which accurately and skillfully portray the experience of individuals living in South Asia or of South Asians living in other parts of the world. A complete list of all recognized titles going back to our first award year in 2010 is available on our website, southasiabookaward.wisc.edu, and we'll drop the link in the chat for you. Today's webinar will include approximately 30 to 40 minutes of author presentation and conversation, followed by a Q&A. Please add your questions and comments to the chat throughout today's event. After our featured speakers have finished their discussion, we'll get to as many of your questions as we can within the time. NSC and I will be on hand to monitor the chat if you have any concerns or trouble as the event proceeds, so please drop those into the chat as well. We'll help raise your questions to the attention of our speakers during the Q&A portion at the end. And it is now my pleasure to hand over the program to Dr. Ritu Radhakrishnan, Professor of Education at SUNY Oswego and a member of our SABA Review Committee. Ritu?
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce Shirin Shamsi. She is an author of at least 12 books, 6 of them by trade, and then 6 of them are educational outreach books. And I'm actually going to not introduce her too much because part of our presentation is her talking about her story, and I don't want to intrude on that part of the process. But we will have time for questions, and we will have time for comments and sharing. So please feel free to put questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll address them. I am going to share some slides that I have, and as soon as I can get them. There we go. That's not what I want to do. It's summer. I'm not teaching this summer, so I want to get back into this habit, but here we go. All right, so we'll start with Shirin's story, and then we'll go a little bit more in depth into the importance of storytelling and how storytelling played a role in this book and the way that this book captures the audience. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'm going to let Shirin start and tell us a little bit about herself and how this story came to be.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm truly honored to be here. Thank you, Essie, Andrea, Ritu. Thank you to the Center for South Asia and the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I want to acknowledge all those upon whose shoulders I stand. Every book is a collaboration of many, far too many to cite, and I'm grateful for each one of you. I'm Shirin Shamsi. I was born in the UK in London and moved to the USA over 30 years ago with my husband, where we raised our 3 children here in the Chicago suburbs. I would like to give a little backstory on the hows and whys of my picture book, The Moon from Dehradun, which is illustrated by the very talented Tarun Lak. My grandparents and parents were born in British India in Punjab. Their families moved to Pakistan after the partition of 1947. In the mid-1950s, my parents moved to the UK, and I was born there. I grew up in London, the middle one of 7 siblings. When we visited Pakistan, I met my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and a huge extended family. I felt connected to my roots, and it enriched my soul. When we returned to England, I felt a deep sense of loss and longing to belong. Books often filled those empty spaces. Feelings of displacement, migration, and not belonging are themes that are woven into my history. We moved to the US when my eldest daughter was just 2 years old. I felt the parallels powerfully. My mother had arrived in England with 2 toddlers all those decades ago in the 1950s. And here I was, leaving home in England, off to a new continent, beginning a new life, just as my mother had. Then when my father-in-law passed away, my husband's mother came from Pakistan to live with us. She often shared stories with my children. She had experienced the same traumas of migration, loss, and displacement. In the 28 years she lived with us, she related stories of her childhood, rich with culture and history. I felt the need to record this history for my children and for future generations. Themes of belonging, displacement, and migration run throughout my family history, so I can't help but write about such themes that are so close to home. A dear family friend who is a clinical social worker, works at a local advocacy center in Chicago. She told me, and these are her words, she told me oftentimes children who experience trauma feel very alone in their experience. A book may be one of the first times they see their experiences described or played out externally. And if they see hope, it helps them envision an outcome they maybe haven't envisioned before. Trauma is silencing and full of secrecy and can be very isolating. Being able to experience different narratives creates a framework in which children can envision change and even healing. Envisioning the possibility of a different outcome and healing can be very empowering. It can create hope in moments of darkness. And she actually uses books in her therapy work with children. Books can help the healing process. Having lived on 3 continents, I've always had a global sense of place and where I belong. After all, we're living together on this tiny planet, and the only way forward is to live with compassion and empathy. The only way we can make it work is by working together for the good of all. The first books we read or are read to are picture books. They have a big impact on a child. Ask me what I read 1 month ago and I won't remember. But I vividly remember the stories I first read and the feelings they evoked in me in my childhood. Fairy tales, particularly Hans Andersen's stories and the Arabian Nights, opened up my world, expanded my horizons. Enid Blyton's mystery books took me on dangerous adventures from the safety of my bedroom. Books have so much power. Books open up worlds and possibilities. Books can save you. Children raised on picture books that mirror their experiences, culture, heritage, and world will feel empowered. They will believe their voice matters. They will feel validated. And I speak from personal experience. I didn't think my voice mattered as a child. Possibly because I didn't see myself or my experience mirrored in any book or movie while growing up. Even now, when I come across a story that mirrors my experience, I get so emotional. I feel so happy to see it out in the world. And at the same time, I wish it had been there for me when I was a child. The inspiration for The Moon from Dehradun was the story my mother told me. I heard it many times while growing up. I knew I had to write it for my children, but I felt burdened by the trauma it carried. For years, I wrote notes and researched, but I didn't know how to make it accessible to children. The more I researched, the heavier the responsibility became. This was a heavy topic, an important topic, and I felt an urgency to write it. Yet at the same time, I was so overwhelmed by the need to do it right. We need stories that represent every child. To use a phrase coined by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, books should be windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. I hope my books are mirrors for some children who will see themselves represented. At the same time, I hope my books will be windows and sliding doors to widen a child's experience of their world by seeing unfamiliar stories in an empathetic light. In the ending of The Moon from Dehradun, I wanted to show a family arriving at the home Azra had left. I asked that it be a wordless spread, because without words, I felt it would make a more powerful point, because the reader will see a family similar to Azra's family and a girl similar to Azra who finds her doll. I wanted to convey that we eat the same food, share the same culture, language, dress, yet we allow outside forces to cause such distrust and animosity. Tragically, we see this in our world today. The current harsh reality of displacement is heartbreaking. All children matter, whether they are Palestinian or Israeli. No child should ever suffer. The trauma that children are witnessing today is unconscionable. I truly believe if there were more Palestinian stories in the world, people would not turn away from their tragic suffering. Over 15,000 children have been killed. Countless have been orphaned, wounded, and displaced. Their voices have been silenced. Every child deserves to see themselves in books. It will make our world more empathetic, kinder, and it is my hope it will end war and dehumanization. Stories teach us, connect us, strengthen us. Stories stay with us. They have a visceral impact. They show us that we are part of a bigger picture that was before us and continues after we are gone. Through books, we can change the narrative. Through books, we can be more inclusive. Children who are raised reading books like this will grow up as kind, tolerant, and empathetic citizens. At least that is my hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirin. And like I said, please feel free to post questions. What I'd like to do is Shirin shared some pictures and they work into the story. So we're going to share those with you and talk through them. So can you talk a little bit about your parents here, and when did you decide to put your mother's story into a book, and a picture book at that?
Well, thank you, Ritu. These are actually my grandparents. So on the left is my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. And in this picture, she's 18 years old. So this is 1925. And then to the right is my mother's father, my maternal grandfather. And so these are the two pictures. I gave Darun Lak, the illustrator, because he was so kind and he reached out to me and he asked me if I would share pictures of my grandparents and my family.
And when did you decide you wanted to put this story into a picture book?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So when I became a mother, I knew that I had to write stories for my children, which I did. I would just write stories and laminate them. And this story, because I had heard it, I knew that one day I had to write it, but I kept putting it off. And I put it off for many, many years until I felt the urgent need to have it out in the world. And then the last visit to my mother, just before the pandemic, I visited her and I asked her to tell me the story, and I recorded her words. And then when I came back to Chicago, I sat down and I wrote it. So, but
Right. And then along the journey, you were able, or your family was able to bring some things back. Do you have a story that comes with this, or is there anything that went into the story?
well, the reason I put this, so when they're leaving in a hurry in the story, the mother slips her rihal, which is a wooden stand that is carved out of one piece of wood. I believe this is rosewood. I may be wrong, but so my mother-in-law, my grandmother, she bought this rihal in 1938, when my mother was 4 years old, and they were visiting a place in India called Roorkee, and that's where she bought this rihal. And somehow this rihal was the one thing that came with them to Pakistan. And then when my mother left Pakistan to move to the UK, she took it with her. And now it's in Canada because my mother gave it to her eldest grandson. So it's moved through the generations and through continents also.
It's quite a global traveler.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about this process. And I did include Shirin's cat because I do think strongly that they are part of animals are part of the creative process. And I don't think she could have done this without the support of them. And so can you tell
Absolutely.
us a little bit about the characters? I know Tarun talked to you about who they were, what their socioeconomic status was, even asking about Gurya. So can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yes. And I have to say that Bramble, my cat, has been with me from the beginning of this story all the way through to its publication. So when the editor reached out and told me that she has found an illustrator, the first thing he did was he emailed me, and he had a list of questions like, can you send me photographs of your grandparents? And can you tell me how they dressed, what kind of home they lived in? There were so many questions. And also then he drew sketches to make sure that I was happy with the first sketches. And this was one of the earliest ones. And when I saw the sketch on the left, I just was so emotional because, it's such a simple sketch, yet it conveys so much. There's so much fear, and, it just captures what I wanted him to capture. And I'm so grateful to him for what he did. And then on the right, you see the F&G, which is the folded and gathered papers that are the first time you actually see your story as it will look like in a book. And that came to me about 4 months before the actual book.
So you did mention to me that Azra's real or kind of based on someone. Is Chotu real? Is Gurya real? Are they compilations of people or family members, or are
So
they?
the story, yes. Thanks for that question. Yes, I should have clarified. So the story is fiction. I had to make it fiction because some of the details of my mother's story were too heartbreaking to mention. But my mother did go on a train. They took a truck from Dehradun to Saharanpur. Then from Saharanpur, they took a train to Lahore, and so that part is all true. But the characters, I just invented them, and the only thing that is real is that Azra is the name of my mother's youngest sister, who at the time that I started thinking about writing this, which was a long time ago, um, she was the only sister who had passed away at the time, and so I wanted to honor her by using her name.
Is
But
Gurya real? Is Gurya
Gurya is not real.
entity?
I just feel like every child can relate to losing a favorite doll or teddy bear, and it just makes it so universal and relatable. So that's how I incorporated that.
And you did talk about the traveling. This is the depiction that's similar to what's in the book, that identifies the Radcliffe line. And did you think of incorporating the map within their story? So did you think of showing their travels and how their travels may have differed within the different towns? Or did you just want to kind of portray the traveling as a whole experience and not really think about the semantics of where they are?
Well, the editor, Eliza, she brought on a partition expert who was going to really go into the details of making sure there was historical accuracy. So honestly, I just wanted to deal with the emotion and the story for the children. I didn't want to get into too much detail. I wanted to leave that for the experts.
And to date, the partition is still the largest migration in history. Unfortunately, things might be changing, as you mentioned before, but as we know, it was one of the largest displacements in history. And you said that you lived in Pakistan for a while. Do you remember Dehradun and Lahore? How did you describe them to an Indian illustrator?
I have never visited India, so I have never seen Dehradun. But my mother had so many beautiful childhood memories that she shared with us. She would tell us that it would snow there, and she would talk about the beauty of the landscape, and so I just tried to visualize things, but also I did use a lot of YouTube videos and books and research. The library is always the best place for research. And Lahore I have visited, but again, to know details of how to picture that, I think Darun did a great job just with his research, because he had to depict it through illustrations. And again, I did focus mainly on just getting the story and the emotion there and not worrying about those details.
So as you did some research and heard other stories, particularly with YouTube, you'll hear a lot of different stories. And as the archives are developing more and more over the years, did any of the stories seem different to what you had heard growing up? Or did you add any of the other stories into Azra and Totu's story?
I did hear a lot of stories from some Indian friends, and it was really so surprising to me that we had identical stories, like people leaving Pakistan, leaving Lahore, for example, to go to India, and people leaving India to go to Pakistan. It was almost identical, and I've heard so many stories, and a lot of them had hope for all the violence and all the tragedy that occurred. There were always stories of how neighbors protected neighbors and give them, hid them from the mobs. So it was very heartening to see that people amidst all that, there were so many stories that were uplifting.
Was the moon a part of your mother's recollections, or was that something also that you put as part of fiction?
I just added that because as a child, I remember always looking at the moon and wondering about it. And I think almost every child does that. My aunt, Azra, her great grandson lives in Chicago. He's 3 years old and he's, always looking at the moon. So I think it's a very universal thing that children do. So yeah, I wanted to use that.
This might be a little bit, you might not have thought of this, but have you thought of where these characters are 10 years later, 15 years later?
I think
movie?
well, because in fiction, you can do anything you like. I say they are living their best lives and they had wonderful lives, and yes, their world is beautiful.
Do you think they've moved around as much as, do you think they're as global as you were growing up? Do you think that they've, or they wanted to stay more static?
Well, the grandchildren and great grandchildren of, my grandparents, they are really scattered all over the globe in, I would say, at least 4 different continents. So maybe 5 even. So maybe that's how Gurya's family, Azra's family and Chotu's family are.
I think Gurya's probably still with Azra, I would guess, as someone who's kept a few keepsakes from my childhood and still continue to. We're going to move a little bit to some of the storytelling aspects, and this part resonates a little bit more with kind of the research that I've been doing, but I'd like to connect it to what Shirin has done. So a lot of themes in Desi storytelling are recurring, but they're intersectional among the themes. So within the themes that you'll see on the right side of the slide, they include intersectionality among them. And I take intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw, which are the overlapping or intersecting social identities. So particularly as we talk about the different generations and as culture shifts, I'm thinking about how people are Indian and American, or they're Pakistani and American, or they're Indian and Hindu, or Indian and Muslim. And so those intersecting identities often feature heavily in Desi storytelling. So some of the themes that have come up in more recent work is the history of both India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And we also know that South Asian can expand to parts of Southeast Asia, but we're gonna work with the subcontinent today. But the partition, colonial oppression, religious division, and caste systems. And as you can see, those are naturally overlapping. In Shirin's story, we saw that very much so. Identity, so not just cultural shifts and dynamics within the generations, and how different generations are appearing through things and considering different traditions and customs and norms, the way that shifts. Belonging, which he talked about so beautifully. Language and food is always heavily demonstrated in these books. And then family dynamics. So we talk about immigration and migration, cultural versus spiritual family dynamics, and then scandals or trauma. And so that the way that sometimes in Desi storytelling, the trauma is minimized or ignored. And kind of you mentioned this early in your discussion. I know that you probably didn't sit down and do this as you were writing, but how do you see your characters kind of having these intersectional identities? Do you feel like that comes through in your book?
That's a great question. Perhaps it does, as a children's book, maybe it's just there are layers, but it doesn't go into that deep. But definitely. Oh, I'm a bit lost here. Sorry.
I mean, there are different ways, because one of the things you talked about was your books often talk about belonging. And for those of you that have read Zara's Blessing, again, she was looking for belonging. She was trying to fit in. She was trying to connect to people. And I think that it doesn't matter if it's in 1947 where the family is in Dehradun, or in 2024 in the United States. There's an issue of belonging. And do you feel like that was something that you thought about consciously as you were writing?
I think it comes through in all my books. I think that's what I have seen, that perhaps it is subconsciously, but when I've looked at some of my stories, I think when I sit down and think about the themes after the fact, I see that belonging is always central to that, because like I said, 3 generations of my family have lived on 3 different continents. So, putting down roots is a big thing, and not having roots. Like when I meet someone who says they've lived in the same place for like the past, their family has lived there for like 4 generations, it blows my mind, because I can't even imagine what that would mean, because I feel like we've always been moving from place to place, and yes, that sense of belonging and place runs through a lot of it. And also intergenerational trauma. I have been thinking about that quite a lot, because there are so many people who never spoke of partition. I think that part of that is that you don't want to give that trauma to your children by speaking of it, but I think it still is passed down, whether you speak of it or not. That's also something that I think exists.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect segue. How do you think the younger generation of South Asians should be taught about the partition? How should it be discussed? And how can it be discussed? I have a feeling there are several South Asian Americans from my generation who don't have the same knowledge as everybody, as Indian born.
Yeah, well, I think it's such an important thing, because like it's almost like a responsibility, our responsibility, to make sure they know their heritage and their history. I just think it's very important. I mean, it's like a trust that we carry, and I think I've said this before, that there's a word in Urdu and Hindi, amanat, which is like a trust that doesn't belong to us. We're taking care of it to pass on. And that's what our stories and our heritage are. We have to carry that on and pass it on to the children and to the next generation. And yeah, because that's kind of roots ground you, and knowing your roots and knowing your history is like, it helps you feel a sense of identity and empowerment.
And along those lines, currently there are 18 states that don't talk about Asian American history at all, whatever part of the diaspora. In 2021, Illinois passed the first Asian American history law, and soon New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, surprisingly Florida, California, Colorado, Nebraska, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, and now Wisconsin, thank you, Andrea, have passed that law. So as we see that, a lot of times the focus is on East Asian history, particularly the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, Angel Island. I can see your book really in being included and integrated in curriculum. What do you think needs to supplement it? What else would teachers need to help teach this book and to really understand the partition and what it did to many families, many friends, in 2 different countries?
I think it's a very important question, and I think that the more books there are, the better, because one isn't enough. I know there's the Night Diary by Veera Hiranandani, and now she has a sequel also, Amir, I think it's Emil and the After. So, and there are quite a few books coming out this year, I think, about partition, or they touch upon it. So as many books as we can get hold of, we need more books on it, because it's an important topic, and I'm glad that it's being incorporated into curriculum, into schools.
In the end note, you talked a lot about the rebellion of 1857, which I think very few people really think about. Can you talk a little bit about how that played a role in how you wanted to show this story, and how it might have, especially the colonial so divide and conquer kind of thing that you included?
So I had a lot of help with the end notes, as I have said, and I have to give credit to my brother and to the partition expert. I think it was Dr. Satya. I may have got her name wrong, but I believe it was Dr. Satya, and she's in California. So with them, I was able to, figure out some end notes. And the history is very, very painful. Like, it's really painful history. And I don't really go into it in much detail. But I think, everything that came before partition played a role. I mean, the struggle for independence was real, and it started in the previous century. So everything played.
What's great about your story is there are no specific historical figures, as you say. It's fiction, and they don't play a role in it, but I feel like they're still there, because this is all happening because people made decisions.
Right. Oh, yes.
And I think that's something that kids today can understand as you speak of trauma and speak of being displaced. The fact that they're all living with these decisions that they didn't necessarily make, and they don't understand.
Right.
That comes through strongly.
Yeah.
One of the things that I connected when I was reading this is something called Kitchen Table Stories that Barbara Smith kind of originated in 1989. It was Kitchen Table Press, and it was one of the first press operations that featured women of color, specifically, how she said, lesbian women of color who had voices that needed to be heard. And what you said was that, you wanted to make sure that voices of the children were being heard. And I think this is a kitchen table history. And we know that kitchen table and oral histories predate the written word. And so what you've done is you've been able to kind of bring a history to another kitchen table, another table. And what Linda Sue Park talked about, and who many of you know her as another author, during one of her talks, she said that you want to beware of the 5 Fs, which are folk tales, fashion, food, famous people, festivals. And one of the things that classroom teachers who are not well versed in other cultures or other countries often lean on these heavily. So they'll talk about folk tales, but not necessarily what went into the folk tales or the context around the folk tales. Fashion is a big one. There's a lot of appropriation in the lower grades of doing a fashion show without understanding what the significance are of the different regalia. Food is a big one. Bring in your dish from home and share it, which isn't a bad idea. But again, there's no context. There's no understanding about the meaning behind it. Famous people is a big one, although only 40% of people in 2021 could identify an Asian person, and that person was not Kamala Harris, it was Jackie Chan. So, and that was in a study by NBC. And then festivals. So a lot of times holidays, you know, the one that I think of is Cinco de Mayo. Everyone celebrates it, but they don't understand that wasn't actually independent. So being aware of these pitfalls that we can help teachers with. And your story avoids the 5 Fs so well because it is an oral history. Are there any thoughts about culture or you know, anything in Indian politics or history or Pakistani politics or history that you think could support or be supplement for their stories?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that, but there are, again, I will defer to you. I mean, I think that as many stories as we can get would be good. Let's see. I mean, I work with younger children, so when I do a presentation, for example, I think I have one in a library. I'm going to do an activity on migration.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to talk about global migration and have a large globe and cutouts of children, which they will color according to how they look. And then we will make that global, you know, activity together. So, you know, I work with the very young mostly in that way, but I do think that it's important that every child goes home. Whenever I do a school visit, I do say, go home, talk to your parents and grandparents about their history, because you need to know your family history, and it's an important and empowering thing.
Yeah. And I'm not a Marvel person by any means, but I know that Ms. Marvel is Pakistani, and she's one of the few representations of Pakistani females in pop culture and today's culture. And this was the only picture I could find of her that wasn't copywriting. So I was careful about that. But the rest of them were white Ms. Marvels. And I know that there is a white Ms. Marvel, but I was quite shocked that there was only one that I could find that was not copywritten. And I think this speaks to your connection to Redeem Sims Bishop, is that we're not seeing enough representation. We're not seeing enough of the mirrors and sliding doors. And when we find them, we really have to pour through them. And so thinking about supplements for Azra, I was thinking about the fact that Ms. Marvel's here, and that's someone that I could see her reading, you know, and I could see her being engaged with, but very few people know about her, and it's a very select few. So, you know, I was thinking of other ways that she could find different reading material and we need to make more books for her and Chotu, and
I agree.
things like her.
It's interesting. I thought Miss Marvel was really widespread now because it's Disney. I just assumed that everyone had seen it, but maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, I think in some arenas, but it's definitely doesn't have the popularity. I mean, if I put in Marvel, the pictures that come up are not going to be her. I had to specifically look for her and kind of dig through, which I don't mind doing. But one of the questions that's in the chat is how old is the very young? Who are the very young students that you're thinking of that you'll work with global migration on?
Oh, they'll be 10 and under, probably that age group, yes.
And so when I was looking at your book, there are ways that I could see it be used maybe with third graders as a picture walk. They might not understand a lot of the context and the historical. I mean, they can understand having a doll. So a picture walk is just kind of looking at the pictures and having the students describe what's happening. But did you have an idea in mind for who the audience is for this story?
Well, I would hope that every audience, I mean, the younger children, like maybe 5-year-olds, would just focus on the doll and maybe the fact that they have to leave their home. And but I do think that it would work for ages all the way up to 12. I did read it to a family night in Naperville, and a high schooler came up to me who had just recently come from South America, and he was quite emotional, and he said that this story resonated with me because I had to leave my home and come here, and I was surprised that it resonated with him. So I would say that it's almost like for all ages.
I think I would use it with high schoolers because I think, and one of the things I'm looking at is how to use this in expanding our understanding of World War II. World War II in social studies curricula is such an integral part of 8th grade and then 9th and 10th grade. The fact that we only know it in a very westernized way, it's important to see how this was part of the story and how South Asians were a big part of what was going on in Japan and Asia and England. And so I do think that high schoolers could learn a lot from picture books. And I maintain that they can still know that. Let's see. Again, please feel free to post questions or raise your hand, or if you have something to share, please do. There are a lot of different materials, and so I did get kind of teachery on you also. I apologize because I thought of ways that I could think of it. I couldn't let it go, sorry. But so ideas for the classroom is to supplement it with diversifying historical perspectives. And as you said, you know, the night diary is a good one. I do have a mill. I haven't finished it yet, but there are a few more books about the partition for middle grades specifically. Again, because that's what's targeted in the social studies curriculum. And that's a way to kind of understand what was going on globally during this, you know, war that seemed really big, but only a few people or only a few countries seem to be highlighted in it. But examining artifacts. So just like the artifacts that came over with people and the ones that were so important to keep, those are part of people's stories and they're part of history. So teachers can use the artifacts, and pictures work just as well, and representations to kind of bring those into the classroom. Utilize authentic resources. So as you said, there are a lot of fiction books, but there are also in the next slide, I have more opportunities to learn about the partition, but using the resources that are out there that have been gathered that historians and people vested with the interest in the partition want to continue. Providing journal props or turn and talk. So these are in response to authentic narratives. Just to give a public service announcement to not reproduce trauma or put people into that, don't have students who don't necessarily know about displacement, put them into a role that they don't understand, but to learn about it as an outsider and what it's teaching them. and invite guest speakers, family, historical societies, and authors. I mean, we have authors who want to come to the classroom, and if anyone here is from Illinois or in one of the states that would like an author, I know Shirin is keen on speaking to classrooms, so there's a connection there for others. But I also wanted to talk about some of the resources that are out there for historical artifacts. So there is the Partition Museum in Amritsar in Delhi. And these are all, they have online artifacts. So while you can visit in person, that might not be feasible. There are accessible websites, and so that students in the classroom and any learners can kind of engage with them. There are the 1947 archives. Again, those are all online. And those have pulled stories from both Pakistani and Indian people who were remembered a lot and remembered not so much, and or like Shirin shared those stories. So there's also artwork. There are narratives, oral history, artworks, and a little bit of artifacts. There's the Partition Anti-Memorial Project. So that's a little more kind of, it started as the Queer Motherland Project, but looking at different stories that are hidden in a lot of the partition stories. And then the Heritage Lab, which online has a lot of artwork and artist representations, and there's an artist statement with them. So for those of you that are teachers or that are looking for different opportunities to learn more about the partition or to bring a broader story, there are different ways to do this and different ways that you can bring the stories into the classroom or into the college classroom too. So I just talked a lot. I'm ready for other questions if other people have questions or thoughts they want to share.
Ritu, there are a couple of comments in the chat.
Oh, okay.
There's one here from Diane that it was such a wonderful book, and I definitely can see all ages appreciating it. Nothing was taught about partition when I was in high school. So yes, Diane, I completely agree. That's, you know, I will turn it over to Ritu and to Shirin to comment further, but yeah, partition was not taught for me either. So having access to books like this and author visits and access to scholars and experts and people who have a familial connection to these events would have you know, really enhanced my understanding of things.
Yeah, Shirin, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that. And
thank you, Diane. Well, growing up, I didn't know much about it either. And I grew up in the UK. So this is British history, and no one ever mentioned it. So it's really needed. And I'm really grateful that now there are stories that are available, and hopefully there will be more written. Maybe we needed the distance. You know, sometimes you need distance so that you can look back and write it. Maybe, you know, that's why. But I know that there are a lot of documentaries now and movies, books. So hopefully more.
yeah, I didn't know a lot about it either, and I'm a little embarrassed to say that my interest started after watching The Crown and feeling somewhat upset about the way history was portrayed and needing to find out why I felt upset, and it kind of took me to this nice new research area with a lot of new books, but I did not. I grew up here in the suburbs of Chicago, and I didn't know about the partition other than what was probably told to me, and I didn't listen. But you know, I wasn't hearing it. And now as someone who teaches social studies, teacher candidates, or people who want to teach history, it seems more important that they know that there are a lot of hidden histories, and we don't need to know every single historical story or her story, but we do need to know that we don't know everyone's story and that we often see history from the victor's perspective. And so what would happen if we had history from the lion's perspective instead of the hunter? And what could we learn from the lion? And I think that that's very intriguing and what I'm hoping our future teachers come to the classroom with. And yeah, Diane said a lot of US history isn't covered in the US either, with the Japanese internment camps, and is only covered because half the class was Japanese American, and it's still very hidden. And it's often a caption in social studies books. It's in the little corner. And they're not called internment camps in history books often. They're replacing or displacing Japanese citizens, or even though they were American citizens. There are lots of words that textbooks like to use to code what really happened. So the Trail of Tears is now, it was a movement, or it was an ushering out. It wasn't a genocide in a lot of textbooks. So there are a lot of different ways that textbooks can play with history through the words that are used.
We have just a few minutes left, so if there are any last questions you'd like to get in for Shirin or for Ritu, we've got a couple of moments.
As we're finishing, I know you can't tell us too much as you're under contract, but what should our audience look out for in the future? What else are you working on, or what other stories will you be sharing?
Well, right now I'm working on a chapter book series, a middle grade novel, and several picture books. I don't know how long it will be before they come out into the world, but yes, I want to write more books for children, because children are the most important people in the world.
And will they
And
be historical, or do you not know yet?
well, the story usually comes to me. The two books I have out on submission, of the two, there is one that is a picture book biography of a historical person. And because it's out and it hasn't been contracted yet, I can only say that when I read about her, I grieved for her, because I thought, I wish I had known her when I was known her story when I was growing up, because she was from, an earlier period in history. And so again, I just felt compelled to share that. So it's whatever comes to me, I just feel like I have to do it.
Yeah. And as we're finishing up, I did want to share my resources and let people know that we'll be choosing more books for it's the 2023 books, correct, Andrea? That's what we're.
Yes.
So the 2023 Saba Book Awards will be coming out soon. But if you would like to know, have more information on Shirin, please visit her website.
Yes, and I think I will speak on behalf of Ritu and Essie and the other members of the review committee that we are eagerly waiting for Shirin's next books to come, so that we can share those with the review committee. And this has really been quite wonderful today. So thank you, Shirin, for sharing this wonderful story with us. The committee just fell in love with this book, and we are so grateful to you now for the second time. So if you missed our December webinar series, Shirin is back with us for a second time today. So we have really enjoyed working with you on these author events, and look forward to doing more things with you in the future. Thank you
so
so much.
I thank you all. Thank you so much.
And Ritu, thank you for your expertise and your time today, and this fantastic framing for this discussion. I think that you have really offered our educator and library attendees some fantastic scaffolding for Shirin's book. And I'm excited to see what folks will do with this moving forward. So thank you all for joining us today. And to those lucky attendees who are receiving a copy of Shirin's Saba award-winning book, we'll be shipping those to you very soon. So please make sure that you have all of your information correct and updated, and Essie and I will be in touch with you about that very soon. So enjoy the rest of your Monday, and we hope to see you at a Saba event very soon. Thank you all.